was coming. It was only a matter of 5 months away before war was declared. But we were enthusiastic, we were young, we were going to fight. Good old England, you know, British Empire, wacko. Doesn't work out like that. After the war, we were left, came home, we were told, that's it, go and get on with your life. But it wasn't that simple. We needed help, we didn't, and we never got it. I couldn't talk about it to anybody, all the things. Although I desperately wanted to talk about them, but I couldn't. I pursued a career and lived my life, and the family grew up, and they all went off and got married. I worked right up until the recession came, and then I lost the business because there was just no work. And it was then really that things all began to come back. My mind became absolutely, totally occupied with what had happened all those years ago. You can think of nothing else. It's all consuming, and I was quite desperate about it. I only found help more or less by chance, some 3 years ago. That has enabled me to make this program, to raise awareness of the problem in the hope that others may also benefit.
It was as the years went by and it started to sink back, and we said to ourselves, was it a nightmare we had, or did I really go through all that?
These nightmares you've got, dreams, which you can't get out of your system. You're actually reliving it. You know what dreams are. I don't have to say what dreams are like, you know, but you're actually there. And then you wake up with a big sweat, believe me, you do. For every POW that's in receipt of a war disability pension, 75% of them get it for a stress-related condition.
I was called up at the outbreak of war, and ended up on the 29th of January at Singapore. We were sent out there. We had 15 days before the surrender. We didn't have a chance. We weren't trained what to do when you're starving and you're made to work like slaves and you're sick and you still have to go to work. In the first 100 days, I got dysentery. As a result of which I went down to about 4.5 stone. That was followed by beriberi. After that, I had malaria. I had gas gangrene in the left leg. diphtheria, and also from ill treatment I got, my jaw was very badly damaged. All in all, it was a very grim experience.
The Japanese commandant in this case, in this camp, had 6 eggs. The next day, his eggs went missing, and he said, "Tell me who took my eggs or I take this man's head off." He asked us again. Nobody said anything, because we just didn't know. And he brought his sword down, and he didn't really take the head off completely. The head just fell forward onto this man's chest, and it stood for fully 2 or 3 seconds before it fell forward, with the blood spurting out the back of the neck. We were in a state of shock by this time. We had seen some atrocities, but this was something that we had never experienced. This particular day, there was this terrible flash in the sky, and we thought, oh, an ammunition dump or something's got. But the following day, they split us into working parties, and I was on board this truck. It took us into Hiroshima. And then they gave us a handcart, and we were told to go around and pick up bodies, and I was picking up women and children. Some of the women we picked up even still had the babies in their arms. They have these watchtowers all over the place, and static water tanks. And what had happened was the excessive heat had made some of the people try to get away from it, jump into those static tanks, and they just boiled alive. So when we leaned over to pull them out, if you grabbed an arm, it just came away, or a leg. But we had to get them out. That was our job. God, it makes you wonder, is there a God when he allows such things to happen, really? Because all those Japanese bodies that I shoveled into those graves, they hadn't done anything to me. Nothing at all, really. It's quite incredible. But here I am, 75 years of age, still kicking. Thanks to my wife who's looked after me, really.
These are men whose minds the dead have ravished. Memory fingers in their hair of murders. Multitudinous murders they once witnessed. Always they must see these things and hear them. Batter of guns and shatter of flying muscles. Carnage incomparable, and human squander ruck too thick for these men's extrication.
With women, the biggest trauma, the biggest distress was with the air raids, the sounds and the smells of the air raids, of the aeroplanes, the buzz bombs and the rockets in particular.
You'd hear the drone of the planes, and because there was a lot of them, you think, oh my God, what's going to happen, you know, because you know jolly well that there's going to be a lot of bombing going on, and you get all sort of wound up inside and try very hard not to get in a panic.
Women tended to suppress their own fear because they didn't want to frighten the children. And also there was very much a feeling of, you know, we're all in this together and we've got to get on and do what has to be done.
I suppose because I'd got 3 men to feed for a few months until my brother married, and because I was working in the office and coming home and doing the shopping and things like that, I think that it probably took it off because I had so much on my mind.
One lady talked about being in an air raid shelter when Plymouth was being bombed, and when the raid was over, going onto the roof of the building where she worked and looking out over the devastated city. And she said that that was a picture that came back to her regularly, that this picture of complete destruction.
I thought they were all dead, you see. And it used to get quite distressing, really. So nobody talked about it unless they had something funny to say, you know, about it. Nobody seemed to be distressed. They probably were very wound up inside, but they didn't show it.
Plymouth. Here in this famous seaport, badly hit by many air raids, the people still laugh, still dance. It's an ancient custom dancing on Plymouth Hoe, and the music floats over the ruins.
I think in the end it makes it more difficult to deal with because it's using avoidance as a coping strategy, which at the time, in the short term, is probably a good coping strategy. But if they found that it's worked for them in the short term and continue using that in the long term without actually dealing with the traumas, then that can cause problems later on, because then they get the memories resurfacing.
I pray you to believe what I have said. I reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words.
I arrived in Portsmouth. I was 6.5 stone in weight. I went before a medical team the following morning, was pronounced fit. They told me I might have trouble with my right leg and I may not be able to have children because they reckon that the rays when I was in Hiroshima had made me sterile. But I accepted that because all I wanted to do was get home anyway. And they gave me my rail warrant to get home to Edinburgh. I phoned my mother, told her which train I was coming home on, and that was it. I was home. There was no treatment, none at all. But when we saw those hostages coming back from the Gulf and the treatment they got compared to what we got, I mean, we should have been psychoanalyzed straight away when we came back because of the horrors we'd been through, but nothing like it.
I think those who were back in the country, my parents and my wife, probably expected things to return to what they were before. But in fact, they couldn't do that. I mean, we weren't the same people anymore. I wasn't the same person anymore. And also the fact that my daughter, bless her heart, it took her a long time to accept that this man who'd suddenly come into her life, you know, was really her father. But that was the beginning of what was quite a difficult time of adjustment.
I could never understand these terrible, terrible moods because you go for days and not speak to me. And when you're young and you're just married, you know, I mean, nowadays they wouldn't stand it 5 minutes, you'd be divorced.
When he come home, he was a rattle of bones and very, very nervous. You know, he was always joking. He couldn't even stand the children. You know, when we had our family, the children had to be kept quiet.
The children say Dad mellowed as he got older, but he was always he wasn't capable of loving them. He did love them, he loved his family, but it wasn't demonstrative.
What I did notice when he came back was he would want to go away and be on alone, you know. And of course, not having seen him for so long, I wanted to be with him.
Our wives stood for it, and my wife particularly, I do not know, believe me. It's a wonder she didn't leave me, because I couldn't help it. I just couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. It was just one of those things. The biggest stress-related features we have is anxiety, panic sensations, stress, nightmares, increasing as they get older. We try to avoid the word psychiatry. It frightens them, it buttons them up. And if I can only get it through to them, you're locked up and we want to unlock it, except that you've got a psychological problem. There's a whole new life waiting for them. Oh, God, I've got men who won't go for this treatment, refuse to accept that they've got a psychiatric problem. I say, oh, come on, George, you know that you're sitting in the house here all day, you're doing nothing. You've seen how Henry is now, he's a trend, he's a different man. Nothing wrong with me, nothing wrong with me, and curse at you and tell you to get out of the house. You know, stay locked in his rooms, and then you tell him, there's a reunion shortly, George. You're coming to, yes, you're coming to the reunion. That's not the same man. It really isn't the same man. They go mad. Because they've all shared an experience which is indescribable. And they feel at home, they feel natural. They notice they break down and cry, there's someone to pat them on the shoulder and fully understand what the trouble is.
He would say to me, you don't know what I'm going through. If there's any reunions, we're going to that reunion because we could talk. He could sit and talk to the boys, not about the atrocities that happened, but just the, you know, relaxation he had with them. There was a bond of affection amongst these boys that nobody else can understand but these boys.
You know, you can get a group of people and some trivial little thing on the television. It's happened to me. They'll weep, they'll cry. And this happens quite a lot. You try to think back. Why am I like this? And I really don't know the answer. We try to find an answer. Why we suddenly become emotional? Why we suddenly become fraught? There's not many Far East POWs, by the way, who haven't had some form of a nervous breakdown.
Mr. Cairns asked if he would come and be interviewed. He was a bit apprehensive, and he said, well, I should break down. And Steve, well, that would be all right, because that's what it's all about. And I said, well, I'll come in with you. So he agreed that he would, but when we sat out there waiting, he got so worked up and was on the point of tears. He said, I can't do it, let's just walk away. And I said, well, you can't do that. I'll explain to the lady when she comes out that you don't want to do it, which is what I did, you know. But he couldn't have done it. If he'd come before the camera, all you would have got from him was floods of tears. Well, I think if this was about 20 years ago, there was a chance he could have done. He would have possibly broken down during it, but you would have also got something out of him as well. I mean, they've all suffered with their nerves, and as they've got older, it's got worse. And I say living with them is like living on a knife edge some days. It's been difficult to understand. It's taken us wives years to understand it, really.
I've got men here who suffered hell and purgatory for 3.5 years. What kind of post-traumatic stress is that?
Stress, trauma, this is a new word, trauma, stress, and all that. It only come out in a Gulf War, but we had 4 years of that. And every morning you didn't know whether you were going to get killed that day or bashed up or what.
We received no counselling after the war. Such a thing was then not known about. In more recent years, awareness has improved, but there is still no proper follow-up.
The admission of the reality of battle stress is relatively recent, but you can see in paintings of Waterloo something on the faces of the men that we would now describe as battle shock.
The first really good clinical account was probably around 1860. That was during the Civil War when they called it nostalgia. The idea then was that it was partly the being away from family and friends was the main causative factor in this, not necessarily the war itself. By the time you get to the First World War, it was thought to be cowardice at first. And a number of people who were executed for cowardice during World War I were quite clearly probably suffering from the effects of battle rather than cowardice. Later it was referred to as gas hysteria, trench hysteria, shell shock, and there the idea was that people had been close to a shell that had exploded. It had somehow rattled their brain around in their head, and as a consequence caused them to be in the shocked state.
Does it matter, losing your legs? For people will always be kind, and you need not show that you mind when the others come in after hunting to gobble their muffins and eggs. Does it matter losing your sight? There's much splendid work for the blind, and people will always be kind as you sit on the terrace remembering and turning your face to the light. Do they matter, those dreams from the pit? You can drink and forget and be glad, and people won't say that you're mad, for they'll know you've fought for your country, and no one will worry a bit.
The appropriate methods of treatment were discovered. They were that you treat people as close to the front line as possible, as soon after the onset of problems, with an expectation that they're going to return to duty. But by the time you get to World War II, there seems to be almost no recognition of that, so that it's almost like going through the same learning process with each war. The Falklands was an interesting one because although the Army and Navy were well aware of the problems of combat stress reactions, there were no land-based psychiatrists. If you look at the Gulf War, that's the first time that there were field psychiatric personnel deployed as teams in advance of a problem being obvious. The Gulf War involved a relatively small number of people, 45,000, I think, British troops serving there, something around that. Whereas the numbers who were serving during World War II was extremely large. People gave enormous chunks of their lives, 5 or 6 years in many cases. And it's an enormous commitment at a time when the country clearly needed it.
The nightmares were so vivid that sometimes when I came out of the nightmare, I didn't know where I was. I thought I was back in the prison camp, you know. And I used to have to get up and walk around looking at familiar things to sort of get myself, as it were, out of the nightmare. The other nightmare I used to have was about a young guy, and he was in such a state, and he said to me, put his hand over the side of the bed and said, hold my hand, will you? And shortly after that he died, and that had a terrible impression on me. And he was only a kid. He couldn't have been more than about 20. And I don't know, it had a terrible effect, and I've carried it with me all my life.
A lot of people have found that the memories have come back almost with a vengeance. There's nothing now to block out what had happened to them, and so they're faced with coming to terms with it. I think the other thing that happens is, as we all get older, we want to review what's happened in our lives to try and make sense of it. I think there's an element of that as well.
Treatment is available, and those who have had it say it changes their lives. Why have we had to wait until we are in our 70s? If you belong to a veterans association, you might know about these things, but if not, and thousands don't, you feel isolated and alone. We approached the Department of Health and the Ministry of Defence, but they wouldn't comment. Is it because we are old and nearing the end of our lives? We feel ignored and forgotten. It may be 50 years ago, but help can work.
That psychiatric approach is working because I feel so much better for it. And I can talk about it This interview I'm giving you now, I wouldn't have given you 10 years ago. No way.
I had a total of, I think, about 4 months, weekly sessions over 4 months. And the effect was remarkable because it was, I can best describe it by saying that it was like coming out of a black hole and having a door opened and walking out into the light. All those years that I desperately wanted to talk to somebody and couldn't.
Were you able to cry about
No, that's another thing. Dr. Lucas warned me that would happen. And the first time it happened, during the group therapy, I felt thoroughly ashamed of myself, really. But the psychiatrist, there was one chap came to put his arm around me, another chap I didn't know, was sitting in the group, you know, and he was ordered back to his seat, said, your turn will come, it's got to come out, just let him cry.
At least in the remaining years that I have, I have the benefit of having got rid of that awful sort of business of not being able to tell anybody. And if there's anybody out there who watches this program, who has been through the same or similar experiences, and they're like I was, not able to talk to anybody, go and find someone. Go and find someone that you can talk to, because it will change your life.